Hey, family, did you know that Vanilla Ice could have possibly been more than a one hit wonder? Well, we're going to talk about that and more on this week's episode of the internet's number
Number
one
one.
podcast for the culture, Reading with the Culture. Welcome to episode 4 of the podcast. Sorry it took us forever to get here, but thanks for the increase in support. Y'all are really sharing the content, and our views and listens have grown over the month. Like we often say, if you've been here before, then we believe that you either like what you heard, or you like what we're reading, or maybe you just might be a hater hanging around to watch the show fail. But in all cases, you know how we do, and we appreciate your support. If it's your first time rocking with us, welcome to the internet's number one podcast for the culture, Reading with the Culture. We're an online book club for our culture, but not limited to our culture. We drop content weekly and try to respond to any questions, comments, or DMs we receive through social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at RWT Culture. That's RWTCULTURE. And you can now find our podcast on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and many other places that you can find podcasts. Just type Reading with the Culture in the search bar. And we appreciate your support in advance. Now, we are still in our autobiography arc, and we are still on The Art and Science of Respect by Jay Prince. But before we jump into today's episode, we're just going to answer one of the questions or comments that we received after last episode. There were a couple more, but since you guys don't want to post them, I'm just gonna answer one. So one of our readers or listeners mentioned that they want to get the book and they want to read along. How would I suggest that they do that? Now, I could mostly speak for me, but first, the best thing to do is to support the content creator directly and try to source it from them. So there'll be times where I will provide the links in the description box below so that you can reach out to the content creator directly and get it. Other times you may just have to do your own research to get the book that way. But the alternative way, which is the more convenient, popular way, is to just, if you have a smartphone, you can download the Kindle app. I'm not sponsored by Amazon or anything, but that may be something for me to look into in the future. But yeah, download Amazon Kindle app, and most of the books that I'm reading are definitely on there. I'm the type of person that I do everything with my phone. Like, my notes are in my phone. I read all my articles, research, a lot of things I do from my phone. So it isn't a problem for me to also read books from my phone. If you find that that's not an issue for you, I definitely suggest you getting a library going in your Kindle app, and just you can start with the books that I'm reading, or just go off of books that you've always wanted to read. The books on there are generally cheap. I believe this book was maybe like $10, no more than $15. But yeah, there's books on there for like $4, $5. So it all depends on what works for you. But that's what I would suggest. There's also Audible for our listeners that learn better or retain information better through listening. So that's another way you can have the book read to you. You can download Audible, which I also believe is an Amazon app. Again, not sponsored by Amazon, but I'm here.
Amazon, y'all better stop playing.
So moving on, We're almost finished with this book. This will be the last episode on this book. I had to skip out a lot, and I'm going to also have to skip out a lot today to finish the book. But there's a lot more that I could have done with it. And if you pick it up, I'm sure as you read, you'll see there's a lot more than, what we talked about in these couple of episodes. It's definitely a good read. And if you haven't read anything in a while, but don't want to get into anything that's too deep, then this is definitely a great book to start off with. It is deep, but like I said, we're going to go into other books that are a little bit more heavy content, but that'll be, later on in the series. So on today's episode, we just want to wrap up talking a little bit about Vanilla Ice, as we already mentioned. We'll speak a little bit about Lyor Cohen. We'll also address Larry Hoover, Floyd Mayweather, Andre Ward, and we'll talk a little bit about James's philanthropy or giving back to Houston's Fifth Ward. Now, many of you should be familiar with that track you just heard. That's Vanilla Ice's Ice Ice Baby. Vanilla Ice, whose real name is Robert Van Winkle, is from Texas. Dallas, Texas to be exact. And in the late 80s, like any other artist who was pursuing rap in that Houston area, they were hanging around the Rap-A-Lot record studios. One night at a nightclub, Prince recalls, he was approached by a tall, skinny white boy with blonde hair. He looked goofy, and then he got up to dance, which made him look even goofier, but this also grabbed Prince's attention. So later on that night, Robert approached Prince and, played some of his music for Prince so that, Prince can get an idea of what kind of artist this is. Prince can't recall if the sample or the beat that was used was the same, but he remembers the hook, Ice Ice Baby, Vanilla Ice Ice Baby. So Prince, sensing that there was something there, told his engineer, Cliff Blodgett, to sign him. Now, some time goes by, and Cliff runs the company's day-to-day operations, and Prince is out, scouting for talent in the nightclubs, trying to get records and things like that played. One day, he hears Ice Ice Baby being played back-to-back on the radio, and his first thoughts are, one of our artists just got a major break. But Cliff never signed him. He didn't think Vanilla Ice was worth the trouble. So Rob and his manager, Tommy Kwan, signed a deal with Ichiban instead. And just like that, Rap-A-Lot Records lost out big time. Had he had the opportunity or gotten signed by Rap-A-Lot Records, maybe his career would have turned out a little bit differently. But for now, he's known as the one-hit wonder, Vanilla Ice. So moving on, we're going to talk about Lyor Cohen. For those of you who don't know or aren't as familiar with Mr. Cohen, he's a music industry executive. He's been in the industry for more than 30 years. He's probably most recognized for, his time in Def Jam and his ongoing issue or beef. Well, not that he has a beef with Dame Dash, but Dame Dash definitely has a beef with Lyor Cohen. Currently, Cohen owns his own independent label, 300 Entertainment, and some of the artists on this label include, but not limited to, Fetty Wap, Young Thug, and Megan Thee Stallion. But the way that Lyor interacts with Jay Prince is actually a positive experience, so we'll just talk about it briefly here a little bit. So after their loss of Vanilla Ice with the multi-platinum Ice Ice Baby, they tried a couple of new things. They signed 2 new acts, Royal Flush and Def 4. Cliff and DJ Ready Red were excited about the acts, but it didn't really sit right with Prince, seeing as 1, they weren't gangster rappers, or 2, They weren't even from the South. They were from Brooklyn, Chicago, and New York. So then Cliff's following idea was to relocate Rap-A-Lot Records from Houston to New York. Prince agreed, and they took a chance, another leap of faith, especially since in the 90s, New York was the home for rap, no question. So it seemed like an idea that made sense. But what actually ended up happening was they got lost in the sauce in New York. But Prince ended up reconnecting with Cohen and actually ended up shadowing him for the next couple of months. They had met a few years prior at a Run DMC concert. Prince liked Cohen and the ability that he had to command a room without making anyone feel less important. Prince utilized his time in New York to spend as much time as possible in the Def Jam office. He soaked up the atmosphere, observing the different departments, and eventually he got all his questions answered and got some great advice. Watching everything move in the Def Jam office just gave Prince the inspiration that he needed. Prince admired that Def Jam had their own world, but he also knew that him and his gang of a bunch of country guys from Houston trying to fit in wasn't the direction for Rap-A-Lot Records. So he let Cliff and Red know, the producer and the engineer, that he was ready to move it back to Houston. So he packed it up. They didn't agree at first, but they eventually packed it up and they moved it all back to Houston. And after that, Prince called a meeting and changed the face of Rap-A-Lot Records. This was a pivotal point for Rap-A-Lot because following this is when he cut everyone from the group except for Little Billy, who turned into Bushwick Bill, and that's when they found Willie Dennis, who became Willie D, and Scarface. I forget his name at the moment, but that's when the Rap-A-Lot Records that we know and the Ghetto Boys that you know of came to exist. So unlike some other stories that you might hear about Lyor Cohen, this story is a pretty decent one where he pretty much played a mentorship role for Prince and gave him an inside look at Def Jam, which allowed Prince to get a firm idea as to what he wanted Rap-A-Lot Records to look like and function like. Anyway, that was on pages 111 for Vanilla Ice and 113 for Lyor Cohen for my readers, and we'll be right back. Hey brothers and sisters, what's going on? JB Direct here, just checking in and hoping all is well. We here at the Reader with the Culture podcast love to engage our listeners and would love to connect with you. So stop what you're doing right now. Put it down. Stop. Yes, you. And make sure you take this time to give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. You can also get alerts when we drop new content if you click this bell after you subscribe. You can also find Reading with the Culture on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many other apps that support podcasts. We appreciate your support in advance. At RWT Culture on all platforms. Peace. And we pick up back in chapter Larry Hoover on page 133. For those of you who don't know who Larry Hoover is one of the founders of a Chicago street gang called the Gangsta Disciples, or GDs for short. Hoover is currently serving 6 life sentences at the ADX Florence prison in Florence, Colorado. 6 life sentences equates to 150 to 200 years in prison. Partially because while he was locked up, after a 17-year investigation, he was charged with conspiracy and extortion, money laundering, and a whole bunch of other things, and continuing to run a criminal enterprise from a state prison. So he's a pretty serious guy. Yeah. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him and Mayweather and Andre Ward on the next episode. Well, actually, it's still going to be this episode, but I'm actually going to do a part 2 because I definitely want to drop the episode tonight and I don't want to delay it. So thank you for rocking out with us in this episode. We're going to see you tomorrow night on the other side. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Hit us with some comments, some DMs. Show us some love. Oh, and last but not least, I'm just here to remind you that you can pick your friends, you can pick your nose, but ain't nothing wrong with picking up a good book every now and again. Peace, love, and guidance, family.
The Reading with the Culture podcast is an independent podcast sponsored by no one yet, but we will be.